I just want to start off by saying, if you want an answer at the end, prepare to be disappointed. There just isn't one. I was an intern at Nickelodeon Studios for a year in 2005 for my degree in animation. It wasn't paid, of course. Most internships aren't, but it did have some perks beyond education. To adults, it might not seem like a big one, but most kids at the time would go crazy over it. Now, since I worked directly with the editors and animators, I got to view the next episode days before they aired. I got right to it without giving it too many unnecessary details. They had very recently made the SpongeBob movie, and the entire staff was somewhat sapped of creativity, so it took them longer to start the season, but the delay lasted longer for more upsetting reasons. There was a problem with the series 4 premiere that set everyone and everything back for several months. Me and 2 other interns were in the editing room, along with the lead animators and some editors for the final cut. We received the copy that was supposed to be Fear of a Krabby Patty, and gathered around the screen to watch. Now, given that it isn't final yet, animators often put mock title cards, sort of an inside joke for us, with phony, oftentimes lewd titles such as How Sex Doesn't Work instead of Rockabye Bye Valve, when SpongeBob and Patrick adopt a sea scallop. Nothing particularly funny, but work-related chuckles, so when we saw the title card, Squidward Suicide, we didn't think it more than a morbid joke. One of the interns did a small throat laugh at it. The happy-go-lucky music plays is normal. The story began with Squidward practicing his clarinet, hitting a few sour notes like normal. We hear SpongeBob laughing outside, and Squidward stops, yelling at him to keep it down because he has a concert that he needs to practice for that night. SpongeBob says okay, and goes to see Sandy with Patrick, but the bubble splash scene comes up, and we see the ending of Squidward's concert. This is when things began to seem off. While playing, a few frames repeat themselves, but the sound doesn't. At this point, the sound is synced up with the animation, so yes, that's not common. But when he stops playing, the sound finishes as if the skip never happened. There was slight murmuring in the crowd before they began to boo him. Not normal cartoon booing that is common in the show, but could very clearly hear malice in it. Squidward's in full frame and looking visibly afraid. The shot goes to the crowd, with SpongeBob in centre frame, and he too is booing, very much unlike him. That isn't the oddest thing though. What is odd is everyone has hyper-realistic eyes. Very detailed, clearly not shots of people's eyes, but something a bit more than CGI. The pupils were red. Some of us looked at each other, obviously confused, but since we aren't the writers, we didn't question it to appeal to children yet. The shot goes to Squidward sitting on the edge of his bed, looking very forlorn. The view of his porthole window is of a night sky, so it isn't very long after the concert. The upsetting part at this point is there's no sound. Literally no sound. Even the feedback from the speakers in the room. It's as if the speakers were turned off, though their status showed them working perfectly. He just sat there, blinking in silence for about 30 seconds. Then he started to sob softly. He put his hands, tentacles, over his eyes and cried quietly for a full minute more. All the while the sound in the background, very slowly growing from the barely audible, it sounded like a breeze through a forest. The screen slowly begins to zoom in on his face. By slowly, I mean it's only noticeable if you look at shots 10 seconds apart by side. His sobbing gets louder, more full of hurt and anger. The screen then twitches a bit, as if it's twisted in on itself. For a split second, then back to normal. The wind through the trees sounds to get louder and more severe, as if a storm is brewing somewhere. The eerie part is this sound, and Squidward's sobbing sounded real. as if it wasn't coming from the speakers, but as if the speakers were holes and the sound was coming through the other side. As good as the quality the studio like to have, they don't purchase the equipment to be that good to produce sound of that quality. Below the sound of the wind and sobbing, very faint, something sounded like laughing. It came at odd intervals and never lasted more than a second, so you had a hard time pinning it. We watched this show twice, so pardon me if things don't sound too specific. I've had time to think about them. After 30 seconds of this, the screen blurred and twitched violently, and something flashed over the screen as if it was a single frame was replaced. The lead animation editor paused and rewound frame by frame. What we saw was horrible. It was a still photo of a dead child. Couldn't have been more than 6. The face was mangled and bloodied, one eye dangling over his upturned face, popped. He was naked to his underwear, his stomach crudely cut open and his entrails laying beside him. He was laying on some pavement that was probably a road. The most upsetting part was the shadow of the photographer. There was no crime tape, no evidence, tags or markers, and the angle was completely off for a shot designed to be evidence. It seemed the photographer was the person responsible for the child's death. We were of course mortified, the press on hoping that this was just a sick joke. The screen flipped back to Squidward, still sobbing louder than before, and half body in frame. There was now what appeared to be blood running down his face from his eyes. The blood was done in hyper-realistic style, looking as if you touched it, you get blood on your fingers. The wind sounded as if it were a gale blowing through the forest. There were even snapping of branches, the laughing of a deep baritone lasting at longer intervals and coming more frequently. After about 20 seconds, the screen, again, twisted and showed a single frame photo. The editor was reluctant to go back. We all were, but we knew we had to. This time the photo was that of what appeared to be a little girl. No older than the first child. She was laying on her stomach, her barrettes in a pool of blood next to her. Her left eye was too popped out and popped, naked except for her underpants. Her entrails were piled on top of her above another crude cut along her back. Again, the body was on the street and the photographer's shadow was visible. Very similar in size and shape to the first. I had to choke like a vomit, and one in turn, the only female in the room, ran out. The show resumed. About 5 seconds after the second photo played, Squidward went silent, as did all sound. Like it was when the scene started, he put his tentacle down, and his eyes were now done in hyper-realism like the others were, in the beginning of the episode. We were bleeding, bloodshot, and pulsating. He just stared at the screen, as if watching the viewer. After about 10 seconds, he started sobbing, this time not covering his eyes. The sound was piercing and loud, and most fear-inducing of all, as his sobbing was mixed with screams. Tears and blood were dripping down his face at a heavy rate. The wind sound came back, and so did the deep voice, laughing. And this time, the still photo lasted for a good 5 frames. The animator was able to stop it on the 4th, and backed up. This time, the photo was of a boy, about the same age, but this time, the scene was different. The entrails were just being pulled out of the stomach, wound by a large hand, and the right eye popped and dangling, blood trickling down it. The animator proceeded. It was hard to believe, but the next one was different, but we couldn't tell what. He went on to the next, same thing. He went back to the first, and played them quicker, and I lost it. I vomited on the floor. The animator again sounded as gasping at the screen. The 5 frames were not as if they were 5 different photos. They were played out as if they were frames from a video. We saw the hand slowly lift out the guts. We saw the kid's eye focus on it. We even saw 2 frames of the kid beginning to blink. The lead sound editor told us to stop. He had to call the creator to see this. Mr. Hillenberg arrived within about 15 minutes. He was confused to why we called him down there, Taylor just continued the episode. Once a few frames were shown, all screaming, all sound again stopped. Squidward just started staring at the viewer full frame on the face for about 3 seconds. The shot quickly panned out and a deep voice said, "Do it." And we see it. Squidward hands a shotgun. He immediately pulls the gun into his mouth and pulls the trigger. Realistic blood and brain matter splatters on the wall behind him and his bed, and he flies back with the force. The last 5 seconds of this episode show his body on the bed on his side, one eye dangling on what's left of his head above the floor, staring blankly at it. Then the episode ends. Mr. Hillenberg is obviously angry at this. He demanded to know what the heck was going on. Most people left the room at this point, so it was a handful of us to watch it again. Viewing the episode twice only served to imprint the entirety of this in my mind, causing me horrible nightmares. I'm sorry I stayed. The only theory we could think of was the file was edited by someone in the chain from drawing studio to here. The CTO was called in to analyse when it happened. The analysation of the file did show it was edited over by new material. However, the timestamp of it was a mere 24 seconds before we began viewing it. Equipment involved was examined for foreign software and hardware as well as glitches, as if the timestamp may have glitched and showed the wrong time, but everything checked out fine. We don't know what happened, and to this day nobody does. There was an investigation due to the natures of the photos, but nothing came of it. No child was identified, and no clues were gathered from the data involved, no physical clues in the photo. I never believed it, unexplainable phenomena before, but now that I have something happen and can't prove anything beyond it at all, I think twice about things.